Hello, and welcome to another exciting episode of ACTO's Launchpad Podcast. As you know, on this podcast, every month we highlight and feature change agents, folks that are pushing the envelope and disrupting the status quo of how drugs and devices are brought to market and promoted. Today is a special episode, not only because we have two guests for us on this episode, but also we'll be taking a unique perspective on the lab to bedside spectrum. We're going to double click on what the front line looks like before COVID and after COVID. In fact, we're going to go decades before today in learning how the frontline promotion has evolved, and then we're going to look at prospectively what does the future look like and what can sales reps do today in this ever evolving and ever complex healthcare world to thrive digitally and in person. Without further ado, to introduce our two guests, Jeff Ainsworth and Rich Benedetto. Jeff worked as a sales marketing leader and also spent his time on the front lines for about 15 years in the life sciences industry. Rich Benedetto brings 35 years of experience working as a senior sales rep at a global pharma company. I don't want to get in the way of over 50 years of experience and insights now. So I will pivot to first Jeff to introduce himself, and then Rich, and then we're ready to dig in here and learn from these two wonderful guests. Jeff, over to you.
Thank you, Parth. And Rich, it's a pleasure to continue the conversation. As Parth mentioned, I'm the VP of Sales here at ACTO. Prior to that, though, I spent about 15 years in a variety of commercial roles. I started out as a rep carrying the bag at a global pharma company, and then progressed up the ladder, if you will, and held roles in training and marketing and sales leadership. It's a pleasure to be here today, Parth, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you, Jeff. And without further ado, Rich, super excited to hear from you about your background.
Well, thank you, Parth, and thank you, Jeff, for having me. Quite an honor today to be with you guys. My background, I started as a pharmacist, and I was practicing retail pharmacy. And at that time, Lilly was hiring, their sales force was around 90 to 95% pharmacists. So several friends of mine from pharmacy school had started to work for the company. And I thought, well, I'll give it a try. If I didn't like it, I'd go back to retail. And 35 plus years later, here we are. So many assignments, I've always been in the sales role, different variety of territories, different assignments. So it's been quite a journey.
Absolutely. Rich, it sounds like a very exciting journey, and can't wait till we talk more about it and hear your nuggets of gold along the way that you picked up. And really excited to have you on this episode. I often share with the team here, I have a little bit of an interesting background and nexus to the front lines, not directly, but I share the story. My grandfather was a pharma rep in the 50s in India, no less. And after that, my dad was an Abbott rep. And after that, he was a medical device entrepreneur. So healthcare runs through my veins, and I'm always fascinated about how the profession and the industry continues to evolve. Rich, maybe that's a great place for us to start. From let's hop in that DeLorean and let's go back in time to when you started. When did you start? When was your first call that you had with an HCP?
The first, as I remember, it was in 1982. And it's funny you say that, Parth. I can remember the first call. It's something that just sticks with you. I can remember the office, what it looks like, the customer. But what it was like back then, it was very, very different. The world has changed. Obviously, the world is very different in almost 40 years. But pharma has changed greatly. And if you think about it from the sales rep perspective, there were not as many reps as today. We went today, the pods, the teams, the different things. Each company pretty much had one representative, and they did everything in that geography, called on physicians, hospitals, pharmacies. If you had a wholesaler, you did that. So the rep back when we started had many different hats. The physicians were very, they were obviously physicians, whatever the specialty, that was very similar, but the practices were so different. There was no group practices. There were no, corporate owned integrated health system. They were all private practitioners, and they were compensated very differently. They could practice medicine differently, as I'm sure we're going to talk about a little bit later, some of the formulary issues that are out there. There were none, so they could prescribe and do whatever they felt they needed to do. Another aspect was regulations. There really weren't a lot. Companies did have guardrails, and you had to stay, but the guardrails were very wide. And it wasn't until the early 2000s, I think it was 2002, when the first edition of the Pharma guidelines came out. And then it really started to become restrictive, but it was kind of all over the place before that. And probably last but not least, which is where ACTO and you guys do a wonderful job, is the technology end of it. We didn't have any technology pretty much, no cell phones, no internet, no computers. But one of the things I think we really missed was data. There was no data when we had a dollar amount for a zip code of your product. It was up to you to find out who was writing it, how much they were writing. So we spent a lot of time in retail pharmacies and things like that. So it was amazing to watch that evolve and see the data that was available at our fingertips. Mm-hmm. So I think those are mainly the keys. But I think the interesting thing is the true essence of what pharma and the pharma reps do hasn't changed. You're promoting your product to healthcare professionals in an ethical manner. Hopefully you can provide a way to show them if it can, in fact, help the product, help their patients, and improve their outcomes.
Absolutely. And Rich, thank you for bringing up the patients, because they really are at the center of all of this. And, going back, one thing that you shared that I found was so fascinating was you described it as a bell curve of, going back to the regulations for a second, how it started lean and then it grows and then it tapers off again. Can you speak more to the bell curve, and if I'm even describing it correctly, I'd love to hear from you, the bell curve of frontline promotion?
No, you are, I think. I think, again, when we started down at the bottom on the one end, when we started, you pretty much just went to a physician's office. You talked about your products. There was no ancillary activity, if you will, which we'll describe a little of that coming up. And I think that's where we first connected from your article in Pharma Executive. But we didn't provide lunches, we didn't do dinners, you just went to their office and saw them. And as time evolved, and I could really remember the meeting where somebody came in and said, hey, we could bring lunch to a doctor's office. And we're like, why? And they're like, you can get a little extra time. So we started bringing lunch. And it seemed like that just started the evolution. And then it went to dinners. And then it went to games and Broadway shows and bus trips. And it really was, if your imagination could think of it, you could do it. A lot of companies, and we did it very as ethically as you could, which I thought was, you always had a speaker or a educational program tied to that. So you did have some latitude there, which it was made it on the ethical side. But again, no rules, no pharma guidelines. And this was probably back in the mid 90s, late 90s, and early 2000s. Like I said, pharma guidelines came into effect, and things just, the brakes went on. All those activities went away. You could do dinners, but now the physician couldn't bring their guest or spouse or whatever. It was strictly physician. And then as the pharma guidelines continued to change, they've been revised several times. As we go down the other side of the curve, the speaker content could only be FDA approved speaker content. Back in the early days, it was interesting. The speaker, you pay them, they would talk about your product, but they would give an overall disease state. They could pretty much do whatever they wanted. And as time went on, now it's strictly FDA regulated. The slides must be approved. They must stay on label. So we've come down, and that's not a bad thing. I think it controlled a lot of things. I think I always say sometimes the pendulum swings, and we may have swung too far. I don't know if it'll swing back, but that's kind of how the bell-shaped curve evolved.
Rich, thank you for sharing. It sounds like it slopes up and then comes out gradually, but finds a good, healthy equilibrium. Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. Jeff, would love to hear your experience as well. You've held roles in the front lines, sales management, marketing, leadership, the full gamut. How does what Rich is sharing compares to your lived experience?
Great question, Parth. And Rich is he's spot on. You know, I tell people all the time, one of the hardest jobs I've ever had was being a sales rep. There's so much you have to do. There's so much you're asked to do. And at the end of the day, to Rich's point, you're providing educational value to providers, and they're relying on you to give them credible information in a way that helps them make better decisions for patients and in terms of what they're choosing in their treatment algorithm, right? The regulations, I certainly I didn't get to enjoy all of the things that Rich was able to do in terms of the ball games and those types of things. But I was in the industry when the Sunshine Act and things like that started to come into play. And again, I think it was due, right? I think there was some people that were taking advantage of the system, and these were very important regulations that needed to be put in place, right? I think of that as a rep perspective, and certainly as a manager, someone in marketing and training, it was something too that started to take a role in the strategy and the execution of what the organization was trying to do in terms of, providing value to patients and that type of thing. So I've seen the pendulum swing. I think, again, from Rich's perspective, he's spot on. It's something that I don't know will ever go away in terms of what reps can do and what they can say. It's an important initiative that was put into place.
Absolutely, and definitely those frameworks are important to Rich's point, to drive that ethical promotion, which everyone's very acknowledge is very important. One thing that Rich, you mentioned, which really perked up my thought, was around managed care. So as we're trying to map out the chronology of how things have evolved, hopefully so we can predict what the future looks like with some accuracy, managed care seems to be a bright spot or a salient spot that pops out. Can you speak more to how managed care really changed the promotion game on the front lines?
No question, Parth. It certainly did, because, as I said, in the early days, physician, you went in, promoted your product, he felt it could help his patients, he could prescribe it, they'd go to the pharmacy, and they would be able to get it. As managed care, there's a couple of factors that became involved, but from the prescriptive standpoint and the patient standpoint, the physicians, they were given a formulary then, and then it was like, okay, here's what you need to stay with. Now, from a rep standpoint, if your product was not on that formulary, it made it very difficult. You couldn't get any business out of that physician for those group of patients. But a lot of the problem was, nobody has just one physician, or a physician doesn't accept just one plan. So they have numerous ones. But if his biggest plan, which may only be 30% or 40% of his total, but if his biggest one doesn't have your product, well, now that becomes the overriding factor. And he's not going to prescribe it, or if he does, he's going to give it to the patient. They're going to get to the pharmacy. Pharmacy's going to say, well, you need a prior authorization. It's going to get kicked back. And a lot of times physicians have become so busy that it's like, well, what's my other choice? And they'll pick the second choice. They may feel, well, it might not be as good as this, but it's pretty close. And again, it's not going to be bad for the patient, which is the ultimate key, and they'll prescribe that. So the limit of the pharma reps have become so restrictive due to formulary-based selling.
Rich, that's super interesting. And if I'm hearing that, is that's more complexity and more selling that a sales rep has to do? And Jeff, you mentioned that it's more than just selling to HCPs in this managed care world. Who are all the other? What other Pandora's box does this open up?
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, there was a day when you just went to your physician, they wrote your product, and everybody was happy. To Rich's point, when regulations started to kick in, not only did it affect managed care, but it also affected physician reimbursement, right? Which ultimately started to restrict access between the rep and the customer. So reps had to get very creative in how they spent their time and really being effective in those short periods of time in front of the customer, providing clinical, compelling stories, right? Which was a shift in how they were trained and how we were trained to sell originally. So that's one component that changed. But now reps, on top of everything they were asked to do, now they had to initiate and incorporate pharmacy calls, as an example, into their day-to-day. Which again, that's a different sales cycle. That's a different customer. That's a different persona, right? So reps have to be extremely agile in their day-to-day because, again, what they're being asked to do, it's very complex. And instead of just simply going to a pharmacy to pick up a prescription, now there's different things that are also getting in the way, right? Which is, buy and bill models, specialty pharmacy models, PBMs are all different. There's IDNs that are completely different. So the reps have to know all of these things. The managers have to know all of these details in order to get that prescription fulfilled and get the right drug to the right patient at the right time. So that's how this is continuing to evolve. And I think this is what is going to be here for the sustainable future as well.
Absolutely. Sounds complex as I'm trying to unravel all of this in my mind. Rich, 35 years in a world of this complexity. What's the secret sauce? What's if there's a sales rep starting today, what are some of the timeless lessons that you could share with them?
I think one of the things is you have to really like what you do, love what you do, be passionate about what you do. And my background as a pharmacist, I always felt that this was kind of a perfect fit for me. So, but I think a rep starting today, I think absolutely you have to pretty much immerse yourself into this, learn everything you can. I would strongly suggest, and I know folks that helped me early on, find a great mentor because, getting back to Jeff's previous point about the pharmacies, when managed care changed, he's absolutely correct. We had to start going back in the pharmacies. And what we found was a lot of our reps never made pharmacy calls. They didn't know how to deal with the pharmacist. And as I said early on, when we were the king of our geography, we made pharmacy hospitals. So we had done all that. So a lot of us, I say more tenured reps, got together and kind of helped some of the younger reps along. Okay, here's how you deal with a pharmacist. So I think, having some experience, having some mentors. So I would tell a young, newer rep, find a mentor. And especially somebody starting today in I call it the COVID era. It's very, very different today and extremely difficult. But so I think you stay positive, you have passion for what you do. And I think the other thing, you're working with technology now more than you ever had. The digital age has been trying to kick off for years in pharma. Never really got some traction, not as much as it probably should have. This has kickstarted that. And I would recommend to somebody new, embrace this digital strategy because it's not going to go away. It's only going to improve it more. And I think as we evolve, we had talked about before, there may be a hybrid model. That's what we seem to be hearing, seeing, reading. There's always going to be the digital component. So I would say master it, learn it, and glean every bit of information you can from it. And that's where I would start today and then hopefully proceed and have a great career.
Yes. And Rich, it's interesting, when we talk about technology as a means to help advance the relationship between a sales rep and HCP. To our audience, what is that good? What does good look like? I know in your long career, you must have had plenty of great relationships with HCP. Would love to hear your thoughts on what really does go into, what's the anatomy of a good HCP and sales rep relationship?
Yeah, good question, Parth. I think the interesting thing when sometimes you hear that question, you get that question, everybody thinks, oh, you're friends with this doctor, you're friends with this healthcare professional. Now I was looked, and I do have some very good friends that were people I called on, but what you strive for was just a very good and excellent business relationship, a working relationship, building trust. Nobody's going to really listen to what you have to say or use the product. You have the best product in the world. And, as you present it to the physician, if he doesn't trust you and feel you know the data, you're comfortable with it, you're going to take care of answering his needs, they're going to be a little hesitant. And in today's complex market, there are competitors for everything. And I always said if our company went away and we had some great products, there were others right there. It's not like you were the only game in town. Every now and then you get lucky enough that you have one of those, but it usually doesn't happen that way. So you need to really just build that trust, build that working relationship, and that just makes this job so much easier.
Yeah, and Rich, piggybacking off of that, completely agree. Trust is critical. And one of the ways you do that is through credibility, right? Which is being unbiased, but giving very clinically dense context to your customers, right? And we've been talking about how complex this role is for the sales rep, all the things they have to know and do. Just curious, in terms of, developing yourself, how did you do that? And how would you recommend someone in the industry today to just to continuously educate themselves and develop themselves so that those relationships with their customers are built around trust and credibility?
Yeah, Jeff, I think when you look at it, I know, as you mentioned earlier, with the guidelines and what's out there, Pharma is very limited what we can say now. We stay on label, and that's a good thing because, like you said, there were some liberties taken in the past. I think most companies were extremely ethical, but there were always those outliers. So I think what we say and what we can do must stay strictly on label. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't read everything you can about the disease state, read everything you can about your product, competitor's product. You cannot use a lot of that in discussions with physicians, but if you know it, it's the old expression, knowledge is confidence. You know it, you'll come across, even though you're not saying it, they just sense that you have that confidence about you. So I think the continual learning is key. The other thing I mentioned, mentor a sales rep. One thing I think is also key, and I found this extremely helpful throughout my career, find a HCP in whatever specialty you're dealing with. Find one of them as a mentor to maybe help you along with some of the understanding of the disease state so that you can better, again, it's all increasing your knowledge to get back to that confidence level. And I think that's a great point for all reps to think about.
Yeah, absolutely, Rich. Yeah, Jeff, you were going to share?
No, I just agree. Great insight.
Yeah, Rich, it's what I find that interesting is it's that building that value and showing up with credibility, those are the common constants. Whether you're in a face-to-face world, a virtual world, or a hybrid world, which leads me to my next question. It's what do you think is going to be the future of promotion now that things are changing and moving towards whatever this new normal looks like?
Yeah, I think, and it's interesting, I've not worked in this new normal. I read a lot about it, talked to a lot of people across the industry, did some webinars, different things, but I feel like I have a pretty good idea. I think the new normal right now is a digital world we live in. And I think what reps need to do is look into this world today and say, okay, because I can go back and give you 10 ways as a face-to-face to build value, build with your customer, create value. But in this digital world, I think it becomes much tougher. So I think what the reps need to do today is say, hey, how can I create value for my customer in this digital world? And I think there are several ways to do that.
That makes sense, Rich. And when we talk about value, there's inextricably tied to that is the issue of access, which has been shrinking. And that was actually the initial point on which you and I connected, where you have this wonderful construct of what it means, what access means, and within that confined access, being able to drive value. Rich, would love to hear your thoughts around how you think access has evolved and why it's more important to build value.
As we look at it, Parth, I think, that's how we first met and started interacting. It's well documented that the physician access has continued to decrease year after year after year. Due to the global pandemic, it's not going to get better immediately. So I think, we need to say, well, okay, what can we do today? And there are some things, I think, in the digital world, how we can work with this. We have the technology now, we send emails, we can, give them web links, we can invite them to peer-to-peers, we can do all those kind of things, and either ourselves and depending on which company you're with and the platform they use, or your digital team can do this. But through that, you'll get a lot of information. Let's take one of your no-see customers that you've not seen, kind of wrote him off, can't see this guy. Well, he may respond digitally to maybe emails, maybe a webcast, and just knowing that gives you some information about it. So now, is he apt to get on a face-to-face with you or a conference call? Probably not. But now you have touch points. And I think you start with those touch points, and that if we do evolve to a hybrid model, you kind of scoot out and say, well, maybe I could spend time with him. And I think that's another advantage of this digital climate is you're going to find customers that really embrace it, that want it. They're digital natives. This is the way they were brought up. So I may look and say, okay, I have these handful of customers that when the world maybe opens up, which I think it will, there are some reps out there now, I can just deal with them digitally. And it's going to give me more time to spend maybe going after that no-see, finding ways to access him. And now I have some background on him. I've seen some emails he's looked at. I know what webs he's clicked into, and that gives me a piece of information. So that's where the process may start. So I think that's what it's going to look like.
And Rich, let me double click on that. I think we're onto something here. So one of your earlier comments was when you were starting out, you were kind of flying in the dark, if you will, because you didn't really have any data, right? And what you're describing right now is because of this digital world, and data, right? It allows you the opportunity now to create a tailored strategy for your territory, right? Just looking back in your early years in the industry, if you did have data, how would that have changed your day-to-day?
I think it would have made it a little easier. I say easier, maybe that's not the right word. My time would have shifted. Instead of spending all the time trying to hunt down data, like I said, going to pharmacy, see who's writing what, you could take and put that into other areas and say, hey, here's where I need to build. Maybe and we talk about this creating access. I was I say fortunate, but through my career, I was very successful with a lot of these no-see, difficult-see customers. And the one thing, if I look back, and as towards the end of my career, I thought more about it, it took a lot of time. It took tremendous amount of time and effort. But as we have the data and technology, if I could streamline some things, that may allow me more time to spend to try to gain this access. Because I really, it's one of my kind of hot buttons. I think if we don't solve this access issue, it's going to just keep escalating down and down and down. And one day we're going to wake up and look and say, who are we going to call on? A handful of, maybe low-hanging fruit, if you will. I mean, that's probably a bad way to talk about some customers, but some are, and that's who we're going to be left with.
Yes, Rich, that's so interesting, and I'm trying to connect these dots in my mind. It's we talk about on one hand shrinking access, and then previously we talked about value and showing up to be credible. Suffice to say, in this day and age, if you're getting that bad swing, you better connect with the ball. Is that how I should be thinking about it?
Yeah, that is. It's a good way of looking at it, because you may get one shot, and you better be prepared when you get that shot. It's interesting as we circle around in this access value. It's there's different things that I think about, and we say, well, how do we create value? And it may be somebody we could actually see, but what if it's a customer that you've reached out, they may want samples, they may want to connect on your platform to meet with you. Well, the average, we all want to meet between 8:30 and 4:30. Well, that's not their world. So I think taking an example, you might have a customer that says maybe they're clicking their emails open at 5 o'clock, 5:30. That. Maybe send him then. Maybe connect then. And when you do it on their terms, I think that creates value. That builds up some capital for you, that this customer then says, hey, this guy met with me at 7 o'clock. not a whole lot of people did that. It might be virtually right now, but that remains in their heads. And I think once we start gaining value like that, maybe it's one by one, and eventually, you're not going to do everything in one day, but just little steps at a time.
Yes, Rich. And thank you for sharing that. And I know, Jeff, this is something that I've heard you also say is the customer remembers, right? It's to Rich's point, you take that call at 7 p.m., you meet them where they need to be met, and you show up and you build value, sound credible. Would love to hear your thoughts on customers remember how you were, especially in this environment as things are all upside down in our world. Your thoughts on that?
That's a great question. I mean, there's a lot of really, really great reps out there that want to do the right thing, and then there's some that that provide just a little more effort, right, and do the things that Rich is talking to, right. They're looking for any type of opportunity. They're leveraging data to find out, to Rich's scenario, I know that this physician is active on email at this time of the day, right? I should try to engage them, right? It takes effort. And, as a former sales leader, I really appreciate that, right? Because someone has to have that work ethic at their core to really want to be that superstar rep in that customer's eyes, right? They want to provide that value. I can imagine as a customer, that's something that you would not forget, right? Because most reps, they may not want to put in that extra effort. So again, it's something that is memorable. And again, I give kudos to those reps that do those types of things and those tactics. I think it's a very strategic behavior that they do from a business acumen standpoint. And again, it's oftentimes it's people may not really care what you say, but they always remember how you made them feel, right? So they'll always remember that moment that, hey, you know what, Rich is trying to connect with me. He's aware of my schedule and my time demands, and he's honoring that, right? That all goes back to trust, and it fuels that relationship. Where Rich isn't trying to be this pushy sales rep, he's again trying to be cognizant of the customer's time so that he can provide value to that customer. So it's something that, again, really, really stands out.
Yeah, and that's an interesting path that's opened up to us in this digital era. To take the phrase out of Rich's dictionary, we're in this hybrid world of promotion, and we look at the bright side of the digital engagement as well. Rich, zooming out a little bit and looking at the organization as a whole, what kind of opportunities does this create for a pharma company to digitally engage the HCPs and patients? And having spent so much time in the fields, what were some of the trends that you think are going to get accelerated through the new normal?
Like I said, I think the digital era was there, but it never really jumped to the forefront. I think this will help it. I think, a lot of physicians, and as we talk about physicians, but, as Jeff was talking, I was thinking about it, we're just customers. It's just like with us, with anything. How do we like to be dealt with when we're the customer? We're the customer. We have a sales rep trying to sell us or work with us. So I think that, we're going to find out through this digital platform that a lot of customers actually like it a lot. And I think as we go forward, we need to learn from that, as I keep saying. I know I'm saying the same thing over and over, but I think it's a great opportunity to expand digitally and, look at different methods and different touch points, because there are a lot of touch points to that physician. And I think in this world, there's still a fair amount. And I think this will continue to grow and I think become what everyone felt it would be.
Rich, it's so interesting. We've had conversations with so many folks that have their fingerprints from the drug gets approved and finally to the bedside. And whether it's senior marketing leaders, whether it's folks in commercial learning, sales operations, everyone at this point agrees that this is an accelerator, not a pivot. That not making a sharp right turn or left turn here. We just have to do the things that we were planning on doing faster because it's here now.
Mm-hmm.
And I combine that with those timeless pieces of um, strategies and tactics that have worked, that are still relevant and applicable in the digital world.
Mm-hmm.
One of which is very close to my heart, which is education. I would love to hear from you, Rich. How did the education and training evolve in your time, being on the front lines, and where do you think it should go? Starting with, let's hop back in our DeLorean and let's go back in time again.
Yeah, I think when we looked at it back in the day, it was well. First of all, let's go back to the end of the bell-shaped curve. There wasn't a lot of training. There was, we'd go to a meeting and people would bring their homemade detail pieces, which is totally a violation. But it wasn't then. So hey, look, you could put this in here, and you copied articles from the recent journals. You could use them with physicians. So that's what it was. Okay, for a good reason, the guidelines came along. But then it was so scripted. I can remember we'd head to a meeting and you'd get a 10-page script. And it was like, okay, learn this. We'll go to the meeting. There's questions throughout. You'll spit it out at the meeting, practice. And then the next circuit with your physicians, you will give this message. So there was no personalization to it at all. So I think one of the areas training has changed. Personalization has come to the forefront. We've looked at where that physician is on that sales continuum and said, okay, here's where we are. Here's where we can build on it, and looking for ways where we can always create value for that physician. I think another area is patient centricity. We always did have the patient at the forefront, but I think the modern day training has really taken that patient. And going back to what Jeff's saying with managed care, trying to educate all healthcare professionals, right down to pharmacists, because patients are going into the pharmacy, they need to hear there. So we've become much more in tune with the patient, which is certainly a good thing. And I think the other thing is preparedness. We always had to learn disease state and product knowledge, and the physician or companies have done an outstanding job in training their reps. But again, what Jeff was talking about with managed care, add on a whole other layer with the payer models and the plans and understanding compensations. So that had to be dealt with in training. And I think an area where, which has, I think, greatly improved again in this new age, is the fact that data is available or learning modules when I want to do them. They'll send them, they'll give us a week, 2 weeks. Some people are early morning people, some people are late night. Just do it on your time. And I think when people can learn on their time, when it's most conducive for them, they get the most out of it. So I think that's a key change. As far as where's learning going, I think that will continue. A lot of those steps that I mentioned, I think will continue to go on. I think the available, I love the learning available for when the rep wants to do it. And I think that's key. And I think that's going to get better. And I think those kind of things will evolve in the future.
Rich, it's so interesting you mentioned that. I'd love for you to share the little vignette of the learning days and how it's changed from that to learning anytime.
I mean, we used to have, they say, okay, here's, get prepped for a meeting, and, you're to sit at your desk from 9 to 5, and they'd shoot out modules, and you'd have a conference call at 11:30 to make sure you were doing it, and another one at 2. Now it's kind of varied a little bit, where it's like, okay, here it is, get it done. And I think I told you the other day, a lot of times if I had things to do during that day, I'd just go out and do them, and 9 o'clock at night, sit down. I'm a night owl and do it till 1 in the morning. And that worked for me. So I think I think the reps appreciate it. And like I said, if you can learn when it's right for you, it just makes things. And people have families, and we had young kids running around, and it was so much better that way. You get to get tucked in bed and they can do some work. So I think it's so much better to do it this way.
Absolutely. And, the question that we ask, and I'd love for Jeff to weigh in as well in terms of his experience, how training has evolved. The question we ask is, if I need to know any information in my personal life, I go on Google, or heck, I don't even have to go type anything today. I just say, hey, Siri, XYZ, how do I make chicken limon? it just answers right there. You can tell it's getting close to lunchtime with my analogies. And I don't even have to type. It's contactless. Meanwhile, what we find is the same folks that are going to work the next day, and they have to go through hours and hours of content, sift through that. It's very interesting. There was a study where they found that they studied the web behaviors of 11,000 online users. With one split second of loading time that increased, there's a drop of 33% with 1 second. The time it takes me to snap my fingers, 1/3 of the people are like, you know what, I'm not doing this. So I find that just so fascinating. The world is heading. And certainly when we're talking about complex clinical knowledge, it perhaps is one of the places where it applies the most, those principles. Rich, one more question, and Jeff would like to get your thoughts as well. The evolution of the clinical story itself. We talk about getting trained on the clinical data, and I love the pendulum swinging to the equilibrium point where starts out as a Wild West, then goes to super scripted, then personalized, and you're adding value using clinical data. How do the best reps, in your view, use that data? Because it really is a power that they have.
Interesting part. I will circle back a second to what you were saying as far as collecting all the data and having it available. Because, as I mentioned in the early days, we get articles, and as I mentioned, for a new rep, you want to prepare. There's so much to prepare for. The super high achiever is going to figure out how to do all this. And I think most people, and not that it's a bad thing, but most people want it in front of them. And like you said, if it takes a split second to find it, am I going to do it? Not do it. So yeah, the better platforms we have that can connect everything to make it easy. And this will probably draw some ire, but we become somewhat of a spoon-fed culture as in pharma, and I don't think anybody would deny that. Years ago, it was like, hey, go figure it out. I've had bosses early in my career say, I asked them questions, they knew the answer. It was like, go figure it out, and it would help me learn. And I think today it's nothing like that, which is good, but it's a lot of spoon feeding. And I think if we had a platform and everything's easy to access, I think that is certainly the way to go. And I'm going to apologize because I went back to your topic. And I forgot what you just asked.
No worries. Yeah, I was, Rich was eager to hear about the evolution of the clinical story. How has that evolved over the years?
Yeah, I think the clinical story is an integral part of the whole message because it's all about that. That's kind of the cornerstone of everything, having a clinical basis for how your product works and how it's effective and how it's going to help their patients. So if you don't master that clinical story, I think you're a step behind. So I think the clinical aspect of it even becomes more paramount today and continuing on. Because again, it's a very competitive business, and if you have some solid clinical data, you need to get it out there. It needs to be out there in a way that's efficient, and it needs to be given to the rep in an easy way for the rep to understand, absorb, and be able to communicate it.
Yes, Rich, thank you for sharing that. And Jeff, from your vantage point, the evolution of that speed to information and the clinical story more specifically.
Years ago when I was in training, which wasn't too long ago, there was this shift going from complex, dense training, which organizations have to do from a compliance standpoint. We have to train our teams to prepare them to cover the basics within the label, right? Know what's right and what's wrong and how to communicate those responses. But as we all know, there's a stat out there that says the human brain has the attention span pretty much of a goldfish, right? So again, micro learning, adult learning, all of these things have started to come into play, and organizations have done a great job pivoting their strategy to take that dense information and break it down so that it's more easily digestible. And not only that it's more easily digestible, but it's easier to find it in the flow of work and learn in the flow of work, to Rich's point, right? Which is we all have, these very short attention spans, and we have these packed schedules, and, we're swamped day in and day out. But when we need something quickly, we all want to do it, right? It's the YouTube effect, right? To Parth's point. You don't want to have to read a novel, but you'll watch a 30-second YouTube video. And I think life science organizations have began to incorporate that learning style into their algorithm, if you will. And because of that, they've also been able to communicate and provide tactics using technology to help people communicate that story in a compelling way, right? I often used to tell people it's not necessarily what you say, but it's how you say it, right, to your customers. Everybody has access to a primary endpoint, but the best reps just communicate it in a slightly different way. Maybe it's the words they use. Maybe it's their pitch. Maybe it's their articulation, their gestures, you name it. There's a lot of different ways to do that. But because organizations have started to incorporate these adult learning principles, and they're taking this information and breaking it down, it's and then providing access to this information quickly in the field, it's allowing reps to be more compelling when they're in front of customers, when they're telling that story.
Jeff, that's a really interesting take and insight. Thank you for that. And as I'm hearing you today, and as I'm hearing Rich, for me, it's so powerful and interesting, the timelessness of what you're sharing, yet the applicability in this hybrid virtual world that we're all in, and the new normal, so to speak. And the takeaways for me are: build value, be credible, and make the technology work for you, and use that to build authentic relationships with the healthcare providers. And on that note of education and engagement in this new world, Rich, to end things off, would love to do a rapid fire with you. I'll ask you a question, give your most intuitive, short response to it. So here it is. First question. In your view, what is the future of education and engagement for the sales reps?
Yeah, I think it will. That's going to be the cornerstone, because I said, if you have knowledge, you're going to have confidence. So the way companies can deliver this education to their sales reps, and I think it's going to be, like Jeff was saying, small bites at a time, but easily accessed. I think that will give the rep the opportunity to absorb it all, learn it, and be confident enough to pass that knowledge and information on.
Amazing. Up next, future of education and engagement with the healthcare providers.
I think, and it's interesting, healthcare providers, I think, again, we're circling back on some things, but Jeff mentioned it's not just the physician. I think it's across all healthcare providers. We talk about the physician a lot because that's who we deal with, but there's nurses, there's nurse educators, there's, now we have physician extenders, there's pharmacists. So I think it's not just educating them, it's going to be educating the healthcare, everyone involved that touches that patient's life.
I love it, Rich. It does take a village to treat a patient. Last but not the least, the patient themselves. Someone who is at the center of it all. What does the future of education and engagement look like with the patients?
Yeah, I think, and that we've started to evolve greatly in that area, I think, because as we find, especially with chronic diseases, most chronic diseases, the patient, the physician can do so much with the medications that companies provide, but the patient really needs to embrace it, learn as much as they can, and take an active part in their disease, whether it's high blood pressure, diabetes, things like that, which the numbers are staggering, and we all know them, how many people in this country have those illnesses, but the patients are going to need more. And I think we look now, there's apps available. There's different ways that patients can connect with Pharma. Pharma, I think, is starting to do a job of reaching out more to the patients directly. And I think that will continue to grow, because the more we can give patients, because you can have the best treatment plan in the world, the best medication. If the patient isn't going to do their part, a lot of times it's just going to fall through. So I think education is, we're still on the early edge of this. The patients, the things that are going to be developed for the patients, I think are going to be outstanding and need to be developed.
Absolutely. Well, Rich and Jeff, thank you so much for hopping on another episode of Launchpad Podcast. Today we talked about the future of promotion from the front lines and how there are timeless lessons and timeless wisdom that can help us be successful in a very different world. This world will be different, but it's not insurmountable. There are things that you can do if you're on the front lines, and if you're leadership at a pharma company or a device company, there are things and tactics that you can employ to adapt to this world. Specifically, it goes back to trust, credibility, and making the technology work for you. Thank you all for tuning in, and we wish you all the very best until next time.
Thank you, Parth.
Thanks, Parth. Appreciate it.
If you found value in our podcast and know of a change agent who is working to disrupt the life sciences industry, please nominate them using the form below.